Hi everyone, welcome to In-Depth Film, a podcast dedicated to the art of cinema. My name is Greg.
And I'm Gray.
You can support this channel by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, or subscribing to our channel.
Your support really means a lot to us.
So today, Gray, we're talking about Inception. And the reason we decided to revisit this film is A, it's been 10 years since the film was released, and B, you recently finished up a video on 3 of Nolan's films.
That's right. I mean, I've been going over quite a few of his films, at least looking at the cinematography in them. And the sort of gist of the video is going to be built around one of my previous videos, which is the idea of looking at 3 different films that had 3 different budgets. So sort of looking at Following, and then on the other end of the spectrum, looking at Inception, which is a far bigger budget movie. So we thought, we'd go and rewatch Inception, and because also it's just a movie that I think both of us enjoy, and we wanted to see if perhaps we'd found anything new from a new viewing of the film. Yeah. Did you have any first thoughts about the film on watching it again?
Yeah. So we watched it last night, and I must say I really enjoyed watching it again. It's been some time since I've seen the film. I've seen it many times. I mean, I think I saw it 5 times on the cinema when it came out.
Sure.
Just because I found it so engrossing. We were 18 when it came out. We were in high school, our final year. And at that time, I was so excited about cinema, excited about movies. And so Inception really feels like a kind of a landmark moment, not only in cinema, but just in my personal journey with cinema. It was kind of I would say like a watershed moment where I realized just how powerful cinema could be and just how far storytelling could take us. And so watching it again last night, all those feelings kind of emerged again, and but what I enjoyed was the fact that they emerged with a kind of a new, different energy and with new insights and a kind of a more mature understanding of narrative and awareness of cinematic tropes and storytelling devices. So I was able to appreciate, I think, more of the subtlety this time around as opposed to in the years gone by.
I mean, that's one thing about movies that I really like, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like it's probably quite a common theme, is that whenever I go back and revisit a movie, I always find myself remembering the first time I watched it, and especially with good films and films that made an impact on me, and remembering that feeling of watching it for the first time and being excited, and that sort of rewatching it last night reminded me of that. So maybe before we get going, let's just give a brief bit of background. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the film, but those who are not, Inception's a 2010 science fiction action film. I think it blends a lot of other genres together, but we'll maybe get into that. It was written and directed, of course, by Christopher Nolan, who produced it with his wife, Emma Thomas, and has a pretty all-star cast from Leonardo DiCaprio,
Marion Cotillard.
Yeah, Tom Hardy's in there, Ken Watanabe.
Michael Caine.
Michael Caine. Joseph Gordon-Levitt, etc., etc. It really is an all-star cast. With cinematography by the famous Wally Pfister. And then finally the budget was 160 million, and it was very successful at the box office, raking in about $836 million.
Jesus.
So it really was successful.
You've got to appreciate just how staggering that number is. I mean, to put it in perspective, Inception is an entirely original concept. It has no previous literature on which it's based. It didn't have a pre-existing fan base. It's completely new, and in addition to that, it's not only original, but it's very complex and quite demanding. And I just think the fact that Nolan somehow was able to pull off such a large-scale blockbuster while at the same time making, like we said last night, one of the most experimental Hollywood films perhaps in the last decade. I'd say Inception really just proved to me how advanced and how much of a, I want to say genius, but we use that term a lot nowadays, kind of watered down, I guess. But I really do feel like Inception was the moment where people are like, okay, Nolan is on another level.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, for me, I feel like it's just the perfect template for what a Hollywood blockbuster should be.
Okay.
I mean, it's very financially successful. The sort of set pieces are incredible. It leaves you in the cinema kind of gasping at the spectacle of what's going on screen. It has this incredible cast, really well cast film. And as you mentioned, at the same time, it's quite a challenging film. It's not a straightforward film. So it balances this very careful line of being challenging, yet at the same time appealing clearly to a mass audience. So I think it's a great template for what Hollywood blockbusters can be.
Yeah, and I think Nolan reminds us that there's still so much territory to be explored in the realm of original storytelling. And Inception, like you say, proved that. It just kind of reminded everyone that I think it just reminded us what Hollywood's supposed to be, kind of like what you're saying.
Exactly.
It's like, this is what it should be. It shouldn't be a bunch of Marvel movies, superhero movies, big explosions, disaster films. I think what Hollywood's highest calling is represented in a film like Inception. Original, high-end, challenging for the audience, but satisfying. With an all-star cast, great music, you know, that's like the ingredients of a great Hollywood film.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Yeah. So before we go on, Greg, I just thought it'd be nice to wrap up the plot in a nutshell. So the story of Inception chronicles the journey of a character called Dom Cobb, who is a dream agent, we could say. He's someone who specializes in extraction. He helps. He steals people's ideas by going into their dreams and infiltrating their secrets.
There's an element of there's an element of sort of espionage to what he does.
Corporate espionage. He even uses that term in the film. And in the film, he's asked to perform Inception, which is not the stealing of an idea, but it's the opposite. It's the planting of an idea. And the reason he's motivated to do it is because the person asking him to perform this task says that he will be able to return Cobb to the USA, and he will clear up the what can we call it, the issues that seem to be preventing Cobb from returning. They don't make it clear what's happened in the film, but the bottom line is that somehow Cobb got into trouble and can't return to America to see his children, because if he does, he'll be arrested and sent to jail for the rest of his life. And I think what they kind of insinuate is that he messed with a company called Cobol Engineering.
Yes. I mean, as far as I'm aware, they didn't really delve very deeply into that side of things.
Okay.
But they kind of give enough away that there's some sort of mysterious past with them, and they're clearly after him. Yeah.
So the main kind of let's say what's the word I'm looking for? Well, let's say what the plot then reveals is that to perform Inception, one has to go multiple layers deep into a dream, what they call a dream within a dream. And really the story is just about Cobb's attempt to get a team together and go into the mind of the person that they're targeting and share dreams so that he can plant a very powerful idea in the guy's subconscious.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, one thing that stood out to me watching it last night was that the way that the screenplay and the film relays information to the audience is really great. Because as you've just described it, it is a very complex plot. And yet the whole film unfolds in a way which, although it may be a little bit confusing at times, it's still manageable for the audience to follow what's happening throughout the entire process.
Yes.
So I think that sort of slow relaying of information is really well done.
I would call it like a drip feed of information. You know,
Exactly.
he's not giving you too much. He's just drip feeding. He's letting it slowly make its way into your mind.
And I think going back, and as I said, I rewatched a few of his films recently, and what they all have in common is they kind of, a lot of them follow this method, this idea that you almost don't know the full extent of the story right up until the final shot of the film, where everything is only revealed in drips and drabs, leaving you kind of right at the end with finally a full understanding of the picture. And it's, I think, something that's not always the easiest to do, because I mean, in traditional screenwriting you usually sort of set up the story in the first third, by which stage the audience is usually pretty confident in knowing where the story will take them. Whereas with a lot of Nolan's films, that's only sort of revealed much later. Yeah.
I think that what Nolan does very well is he uses the uncertainty of the audience to his advantage, and he uses it as a powerful tool to tell a story. And I think how he does that is he gives you just enough information to make sense of the scene, let's say to a certain extent, like 70%. But then he leaves a kind of 30% out. And what you place there is a big question mark, which could in the wrong hands be annoying, but when you're watching a Nolan film, it's actually really satisfying. You keep wondering, okay, like what's this about? What's going on? What's going to happen? And then he satisfyingly delivers later on in the story by answering those questions, but then providing new questions for you. You know, so he'll answer one, and then there'll be a new challenge to the audience.
Yes.
And I think in Inception that happens multiple times. You're like, just when you think that you understand it, it's like, okay, now we're going to Limbo now. And
Exactly.
it's like, and you're like, whoa, what's Limbo? You know,
it elevates the whole world of the story. Yeah.
And I think that he's just really good at kind of leading us on, making us think, okay, like we're starting to get it, and then just always being there with a new trick.
And as you mentioned, there's a very fine line when you're doing that as a director, because it's very easy to, on the one hand, lose an audience because they're not being fed enough information, and then on the other hand, bore an audience because there's not enough intrigue to the story. So he really rides that fine line of kind of hooking you along and slowly reeling you in as the movie progresses.
Yes.
Yeah.
I also think what he does really well, and it's worth taking note of if anyone's listening that wants to make sci-fi films or films that have a kind of a grand vision. What I noticed watching it again last night is that because the subject matter is so damn far-fetched, I mean, it's so out there. You know, this idea that we can share dreams and dreams within dreams, and that we can build whole worlds. I mean, obviously the idea of having an architect that can build a dream makes sense on some level, but there's so many question marks. Like, are they designing it in software? Is the level being taught to the people just on paper that they read about and then they learn it in their minds? Like, how exactly is it constructed? Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, because it's such a far-fetched idea, any attempt to try and portray this realistically would fail. So what you notice when watching it is that he actually cleverly kind of hides a lot of the tech and the little things that would add an element of realism. Like, for example, even after watching it all these times, I still don't really understand that machine.
Yeah, the whole sort of all the sci-fi in it really is kind of
glossed
disregarded.
over. Yeah.
Yes.
And what I like about that is on one level, you know, like sci-fi purists might be like, oh, we wish we could see more. But on the other hand, I think it's a really it's a stroke of genius, because what it does is it focuses all our attention on the most important part, which is the story, and the fact that regardless of whether this is realistic or not, this is just what is happening.
Exactly. And I was going to say that it's first and foremost a film based on an idea, and it's trying to bring across certain ideas.
Yes.
And whether that's through kind of VR, or whether that's through however the strange dream machine works, those ideas are coming through as the most important part of the film.
Yes.
So it doesn't bother with trying to explain everything.
Yeah, and he doesn't need to. I mean, you mentioned it in one of your recent videos on Euphoria cinematography, this idea of emotional reality as opposed to, literal reality.
Yeah.
And I think that what Nolan does really well in his films is he focuses our attention on that emotional reality. So instead of focusing it on the literal reality of the machinery, the technology, all the little subtle details of how it works, which would just, I think, suck the drama out of the film, he kind of glosses over that and just focuses everything on the energy, the conflict, the drama. And because at the end of the day, like we said last night when we were watching it, at least from my perspective, this is what I think. The film, in a way, is really about Dom Cobb letting his wife go.
Exactly.
That's actually what the film's about.
That's the idea.
So on the surface, it's like, yes, this is great story about going into dreams and everything, which is great. But the emotional reality is that what it's really about is a guy who's
coming
struggling
to terms with the idea of letting go of his deceased wife.
Yes, and everything in the film really it can be interpreted as a manifestation of Cobb's mind. It's Cobb battling against his own inner demons, trying to find a way to let his wife go, which is what we all go through when we're struggling with the trauma. Is this crazy internal battle.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, so I did a bit of research for this upcoming Nolan film, and the word Nolan describes, or the phrase he describes to talk about his cinematography, is enhanced naturalism. And I think that's can be applied to his sort of filmmaking approach in general. Is he takes elements of reality and just enhances them and makes them extraordinary. And you see it in this film, a lot.
No, you do. And I think what I like about the cinematography as well is that enhanced naturalism really grounds the film and makes it feel. What does it do? It kind of balances out the high-end sci-fi elements.
Yes.
And it kind of grounds it so that it's not too silly or the cinematography helps keep the story focused and clean.
Yes.
It doesn't get kind of caught up in being too stylistic or too grand or
Yeah, I mean, another thing I found rewatching this film, which perhaps I didn't pick up on watching it the first time or the first few times, was how he treats genre. And I think it's quite interesting because the closer you look at the film, you realize that it really is a mishmash of genres. I mean, it goes from being obviously the sort of spy thriller film to there are moments of comedy, and then there are moments which, as we mentioned last night, border on horror, and it really is this mix of all kinds of genres, and yet it works somehow. It doesn't feel like it's forced or it's unfocused. The mix kind of works.
Well, I think again it comes down. We always come back to Nolan's effortless understanding of story, character, narrative. Those different genres work because they make sense in the film. So, for example, when Cobb is going down to visit Mal, his deceased wife, and the character Ariadne follows him down in the elevator. What's happening is actually quite a scary thing. Just from a totally impartial perspective or objective perspective, it's actually quite a scary thing. You're going down into like the recesses of your mind, talking to a dead person that only exists in your mind. That's almost like talking to a ghost. It's
quite psychologically scary.
Yeah, it's basically like talking to a ghost. And so that moment where Ariadne kind of interrupts them and then Mal looks at them, and there's that. They use a sound effect, and it's basically a jump scare. It's a full-on jump scare. I remember watching that in the cinema.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about that is, it works because it genuinely is a scary thing that's happening. And I think that's how Nolan pulls it off.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and that again, it all comes back to the emotional reality that he uses in the film.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's just a good note, just in general, for anyone making movies, that you can allow your film to bleed into other genres, but it has to make emotional sense. It has to complement the emotional journey that your characters are on.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
You know?
It's a very good point. And that's really how genre should be utilized, as you say. You focus primarily on the story. So I imagine when he was writing it, he would come up with a story and say, ultimately, what is the story about? It's a story about this man who's trying to let go of his wife. And then once he'd come to terms with that, then he would probably be asking himself, well, how do we go about telling the story? And as you say, there's this one scene which is quite psychologically scary. This idea of going back and revisiting this dead person and not being able to let them go. So again, it's using horror to show that is quite clever. Another thing I liked about the film was the casting and this sort of very, I don't want to say diverse, but very like a really broad spectrum of characters, which I thought was really cool. Like you really get to know each one of the characters to the extent that by the end of the film you kind of know what they're going to do before they do that. Then
I really liked the team aspect of the film. I loved that. I always enjoyed in a film, I mean, perhaps a good example is like the Ocean 11 films.
Yeah. Even James Bond, it reminded me of James Bond, where you have Q and you have all these, specialists in their field.
Or even, like a film like The Italian Job, or The Fast and the Furious, where you build a team, there's camaraderie, and the audience kind of feels like they're on the journey with the team. And you kind of get a sense of friendship and, just of bonding. And I think that's what Nolan did really well in this film, was create a really great team with very intriguing chemistry. They were funny. There was, the character of Tom Hardy's character, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character. They were great together.
Yeah, good little chemistry there.
They provided some comic relief. And then there was the character of Michael Caine, of course, but I guess he wasn't part of the team. And then I loved Yusuf's character. I thought he was superb.
He was really good.
Yeah, and just, the fact that he was from India? Yeah. Indian guy. And they found him. Where did they find him? In Mombasa. And the crisscrossing from different countries. It also just gave the film that wonderful kind of spy movie level of what is the word? Grandiosity.
Grandiosity and scope and
like this was a big story, and the fact that Cobb could get on a plane and hop to Paris and then jump to Mombasa. It's got this really cool spy agent kind of feel.
And that's one thing I mentioned in the video that I made on the film, is having a large budget like this really allows you to tell stories in this way and to tell them with this kind of degree of scope. And I thought he really used the budget well, because I mean, you see some other films that have $160 million budgets, and yet there's a lot of VFX, and there's not the same feeling that you get from watching a film like Inception, where you really feel like you're kind of traveling to these different places and you're traveling around the world, and it really feels grander than many other films that are shot at this budget level. So I think going to these practical locations and going to these real places really help to inform that.
I think that another thing that the film piggybacks on very cleverly, and all credit again to Nolan for this in the writing, is that the film is about dreams, which we all share. They're universal. And so there's an aspect of the film that everyone can kind of relate to. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about this movie the first time I watched it, were these moments where you're like, I know what that feels like. So for example, when Cobb is having coffee with Ariadne in Paris and he says, tell me, do you ever remember how a dream starts? He's like, no, you kind of just land up in the middle. And then as you're watching, you're like, come to think of it, that's true. And I think there's this interesting, almost like a game that's being played between Nolan and the audience, where he's done the work to identify things about dreams that we take for granted or don't think too much about. And as we're watching the film, we're slowly realizing that these things that he's caught onto are real and that we can relate to them, and that makes the movie a lot more engaging, relatable, relevant. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I'm sure if you were to deconstruct it enough, there'd be some analysis you can make about how it's almost this giant metaphor for filmmaking as well. Kind of the idea of creating these dreams as an architect and creating these environments and then moving through these environments. I mean, it's basically filmmaking.
Yeah, and planting an idea. I mean,
planting an idea in the audience's head. I mean, it's kind of like making a film.
Yeah, I thought that the ultimate Inception was actually Nolan planting the film in our head.
Yes, exactly.
You know, that's kind of, you know, Nolan basically is Dom Cobb.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Ken Watanabe is Saito is basically his producer. He was like, I will honor the agreement. It's one thing that we found quite comical last night. After all these years, though the film's still very enjoyable, we couldn't help but find it quite funny how Saito, you know, shame, he's got so much money, he's so passionate about this project, and what happens, like in the first 10 minutes of the mission, he gets shot.
Yeah, he got the short end of the stick.
And then throughout all the dreams, he's like basically verging on collapsing.
He's constantly struggling throughout half the movie.
Yeah, and then there's this very funny scene. Maybe it's just funny because we've seen the film so many times, but there's a very funny scene where they're in like the last level of the dream in the ice castle, in the snow castle, basically.
Yes.
And Tom Hardy basically comes up with a plan, and part of his plan is he's gonna have Saito protect them, but with a gun and a grenade.
And he's like, no, don't worry, Saito will hold them off. And Saito's laying there on the ground bleeding.
It cuts to Saito, and he's basically on the verge of death. Like holding a gun
and a grenade.
And then shame, of course, we also found it quite funny that poor Saito, to see his mission through, had to basically spend 100 years in limbo.
And then still carried over his agreement.
And then still honored his agreement in true Japanese fashion. Yeah. The moment he woke up, instead of calling his family, he honored his agreement.
Hundreds of years or whatever it was.
Yeah. So the one thing, talking about Limbo, the one thing that I did have questions about last night again, which bugged me every time I saw the film previously, was I'm curious, why was Limbo such a terrible place that they wanted to avoid if they could get out of Limbo by killing themselves? I didn't quite...
maybe what we talked about yesterday was the fact that when you're in limbo, perhaps you don't know that you're there. You lose touch with reality and aren't aware that it's a dream necessarily.
Yes. Which is why Cobb basically came to remind him after all those years that
what you're living in now isn't reality. It's just a deep dream state.
And maybe the reason Cobb could do that was because he was so well trained and he'd been in limbo before. So he could actually manage that limbo space, where most people, if they end up in limbo, they just go on living their lives and they create a whole life for themselves.
Yeah, because he'd lived there for years, I think, in that limbo state. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a sign of quite a good film. There's still aspects of the film, having watched it however many times, that I'm actually still unsure of. So each new watching does provoke certain questions, which I think is quite a good thing.
Yeah. Cool, great. What else would you like to talk about, and how are we doing for time?
Yeah, I mean, we're just about there on time.
Okay.
I mean, maybe finally another standout feature of the film, on a final note, I would say, is the music by Hans Zimmer. It's really a soundtrack which has become quite iconic. Those I don't know how would you describe that soundtrack?
Just, I mean, it's kind of I think Inception gave birth to the trend of trailer music that we take for granted now. There's
exactly. There's like droning sounds.
Yeah, these droning sounds. I also think that what the music does really well is it speaks to the emotional weight of the story, the emotional reality. It really makes us feel the sense of consequence. We feel high stakes. We feel drawn in, and that, I think, just goes to show just how good the film is in building an immersive world that you want to be part of.
Immersive world, and also, as we mentioned before, with all the locations and the set pieces, like, it's a big scope movie, and the music for me does exactly that. It kind of raises the scope of the thing. It feels grand and big.
I think the thing I would like to say before we wrap up is, after 10 years of this film being around, just watching it again last night, I was just reminded how good it is, and how after all these years, how it almost seems to just get better. And every time I watch it, I'm just reminded how good Nolan is, how advanced his understanding of cinema is, storytelling, characterization, and how lucky we are to be alive at a moment in time where we can, share the world with a guy like Nolan. I mean, it's exciting that he has another 40, 50 years of filmmaking in him. And like I said to you last night, I almost feel like Inception, it just seems to occupy a very special place in cinema.
Yeah.
It feels like something different from everything else. I can't quite pin down exactly why, but there's something about it that, like I said to you last night, I wonder what Steven Spielberg thinks of this film. Because it just seems like such a radical, it's very Hollywood, but it's also not very Hollywood. It's something totally unique to me in the world of cinema.
And in this big budget world, I think we really have to appreciate these original stories when they come about, because now especially they really are few and far between, like original stories in big blockbuster format. We might be sort of seeing the death of the original blockbuster quite soon. So I think we really need to appreciate films like this, which could be at the sort of end stages of this blockbuster, unless it gets reinvigorated in the coming years.
And not just that, but it may, who knows when another filmmaker will come along who can simultaneously not only make big budget, exciting, captivating films, but films that really push the envelope on a narrative level, that are cerebral, that are psychologically complex and creative
and challenging.
I mean, Nolan is. I know that there's this kind of a meme about Nolan fanboys, but he really is something special. And I think just watching Inception again last night just reminded me why I have such a fondness for him.
Great. So I think that about wraps it up, unless there's anything else you'd like to add to it.
No, I'm good. Thanks, Greg. I think that this has been a great chat, and I'm looking forward to the next podcast. To our listeners, you've been listening to In-Depth Film, a podcast dedicated to the art of cinema. You can support this channel by liking the video, sharing it, and subscribing.
Thank you for watching, and if you have any ideas for any future videos, we'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Cheers.